So welcome to everybody to this session, which is entitled The Future of Work Views from South Africa. It is, as is evident from people who've attended other sessions of this whole program, part of a series of events dealing with the future of work. And I think it was decided, to some extent, I think quite interestingly enough, to focus at least one session, this session, on South Africa, a country which has really been devastated by extraordinary levels of unemployment, and obviously exacerbated as it is by the COVID pandemic, which has created significant problems for the economy. The panel tonight, and I have to say I've got an absolutely fabulous panel, and you couldn't wish for better, for people who really know about this field. I'm just going to introduce them in the order of their speaking and then leave it to them. And the idea would be that each of them will talk to us between 7 to 10 minutes. We'll then have a conversation, and please feel free at any time to engage with us, I assume, through the chat line. The first speaker is Imraan Valodia, who is an economist. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management at the University of Witwatersrand, and really has a whole host of qualifications in relation to this particular topic, but I'll leave it there for the purpose. You can read their resumes which have been published. The second speaker is Busi Sibeko, who is a researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. And I've had a recent experience of her being on a television program that I host, in which she made a whole lot of very interesting points, and I look forward to hearing her contribution too. The third is Haroon Bhorat, Professor of Economics and Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, and who has literally, I suppose, been the doyen in this particular area in South Africa for so long. And like the other two, it's a sheer delight to have him on the panel. And then the fourth is Neva Makgetla, again, a very distinguished career, both within the trade union movement, in government, and now as a senior economist of trade and industry policy strategies, and someone who really, again, brings a really enlightened and very interesting perspective to this particular topic. So without more, I'm going to ask Imraan to start, and then I'm not going to pop up. So we'll just then have Imraan, Busi, Haroon, and then finally Neva. Hi, Haroon.
I've just shared my screen.
Oh, good.
Can you
okay, great.
confirm that you can see it?
Yeah.
So it's kind of great to be a part of this, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm going to make a few kind of introductory remarks about employment in South Africa, and then just draw out a few thoughts from my side about the future of work in South Africa. I think I'll in some ways set the scene for the rest of the speakers. I won't say too much about the second bit, and I can take that up in the questions. So I'm battling to get my slides to move. I'm sorry about this.
All right, take your time.
I'm just going to unshare them and reshare them.
I'm the last person who can help on you. Oh.
Okay, they should be back up.
Yeah. All
right, so I think they're working now. So kind of really just by way of background, I think it's important to note that we live in the country with the highest levels of inequality in the world. So on your screens, a data set of inequality across the globe, and you can see South Africa and much of the region around us really stands out for the high levels of inequality that we have. And a key part of that inequality is kind of really coming from issues in the labor market, as you come to see. So here's the broad macro view of what the South African labor market looks like. So we have about 40 million of us who can work. There's about 14.1 who are doing something other than kind of either kind of in employment, or else they're unemployed. So these are all of the folk who are not kind of really trying to find work. The kind of striking thing about South Africa is that while we have 15 million who are employed, we have a kind of huge unemployment problem, and you can see 7.2 million South Africans who are unemployed. If you include the 3.1 million who've stopped trying to find a job, really for every 3 who have a job, there's 2 who don't have a job. Here's a kind of sense of how the labor market has been changing since kind of 2008. So it's a 12-year period, and what you can see that is that though the numbers employed kind of have grown. So we've in that time grown kind of employment by about 13.4%. The problem we have is that the labor force has been growing by 24% in that period, and the net impact of that is a massive growth in unemployment. So you have this large supply of labor. The labor market's unable to kind of absorb all of them, and large numbers then remain unemployed. Here's a kind of picture of unemployment from kind of 2008 onwards, and you can see that increase kind of over the period. Kind of you should really ignore that drop. So in the first quarter of COVID-19, basically the survey asks, kind of, are you trying to find work? And since no one could work because we were locked down, you see that drop. But that trend should really be kind of going up there. Here's a more realistic assessment of the COVID-19 picture. So you've had employment growing over the period. You have this dramatic fall in employment, and then the pickup after the lockdown. But really, this kind of rebound is a relatively low rebound, and the kind of question really is well, what's going to be the trajectory from here, and I think the sense we would have is that rebound's going to take a lot longer to get back to the levels that we were. So in essence, what COVID-19 has done is to take employment back to the levels that it was at in about 2014, and all of the progress since then has really been wiped out. So you have this short-term shock. We stay down there, but the longer-term trend is that though employment has been going up, the kind of economy really can't absorb all of the workers who want work, and you have this huge growth in unemployment. Here's the kind of sectoral breakdown for what has happened with COVID-19. So in total, employment dropped by about 8.3%. The impact in the formal sector has been a kind of fall of about 7%. The impact on the informal sector is about twice that. So the larger impact of COVID-19 on employment is kind of really in the informal sector. So what's the broad picture that we would take out of the recent period? The first is the disproportionate impact on the informal economy. The kind of impact of COVID-19 is kind of really to kind of bring increasing kind of precariousness to work. The point about the kind of informal economy is really kind of important to link that to gender, that the larger impact is on women, a massive fall in the impact in the impact on women. The COVID-19 impact, though, is really part of a much larger structural change where we've seen quite substantial capital intensification and this labor market that's unable to kind of absorb the workforce, and that's driving massive inequality in South Africa. So just a few kind of quick thoughts with that background on what it might mean for the future, what it might mean for the future of work. Point one really is that in many ways South Africa could be the kind of example of what 4IR could do across the globe. So you have this massive technical change problem. It kind of drives huge unemployment growth, and this kind of structural problem is one that we've been having to deal with for at least the last 20 years. My sense is that this kind of process of technical change is likely to continue if technology change continues to operate in the way that it does. Two key points to note. First is that you have to think about the gender impacts of this, and kind of think about the role of females in kind of in the economy, bring the lens of the informal economy into the picture. Two is that we've seen massive casualization, Uberization of work, and this increase in precarious jobs is, I think, a feature of the trend in South Africa. We're having a kind of quite a big debate on whether South Africa should have a basic income grant. I think I might be the odd one out, kind of among the panel, to say that I'm not a huge supporter of this. I don't think that it's an appropriate solution for South Africa. For me, I think that the kind of debates about the future of work and the kind of need for technology change to be brought under more democratic control is, I think, the key question that we have to think about in terms of the in terms of the future of work. I think I've taken up my time, and I'll stop there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Imraan. And I hand over the floor to Busi.
No, thank you for that, and thank you for having me here today. I'm glad that Imraan went first to cover sort of those big statistics, because I was hoping I don't have to do that. But where I want to start, and I think this is always an interesting question, what do we consider work? What is work? And so in my presentation, I want to also focus on the social reproductive work that is undertaken largely by women, which is not seen as work in this dichotomized understanding of the economy, which is that, there's waged work and there's unpaid work that is done and basically shut or is in the externals in the household, is not considered as work. So I think to begin to say, Imraan has already said this and shown this, that South Africa has had stubborn levels of unemployment for a very long time, or high levels, and that our unemployment issue is structural because, our economy, the labor market is unable to provide the jobs for everyone who wants them, but also that it's cyclical, that there's deficient demand, the unemployed are more than the job vacancies, and this, well, maybe not in too much depth, but this idea that there's lack of aggregate demand in our economy in South Africa. But I want to contextualize this to say that we always have to talk about work in the context of capitalism and patriarchy. In South Africa, we know that unemployment, Black women are the most vulnerable in the job market, but also Black women make up a larger proportion of unemployed people, so they're disproportionately impacted by unemployment in our country. And so in thinking about this, we also need to talk about geography. The way that our economy is developed historically has meant that in certain places in our country, certain provinces, particularly the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, have higher rates of unemployment. So unemployment in our country is gendered, it is geographic, it also has an age, right? So we know that youth unemployment in South Africa is at crisis levels in the expanded definition. So many 7 out of 10 young people are unemployed, which is catastrophic because those are young people who obviously are going to, make up a large share of our economy, but also thinking about the future of work. What happens when a lot of your youth are unemployed, and what does that look like for your future economy? So there are other intersections that we can look at this for, and so look at this issue of capitalism and patriarchy and how our country's developed and who's unemployed, where do they live, what is their age, and there are many, people living with disabilities, which I haven't really covered here, but to say that those are key considerations when thinking about unemployment and how we tackle unemployment in our country. So in thinking about the future of employment particularly, it is important that our policies respond to these intersectional needs that people have. So in thinking about what has happened in COVID-19, we obviously, as already noted, informal workers were particularly hit, and the informal economy has always been seen as an absorber of workers in a way when we talk about waged work. And so what it's demonstrated is that, informal workers are quite precarious. And, women in particular, so our analysis at the IEJ shows that when you look at Q4 2019 and Q4 2020, what you find is that the people who lost their jobs disproportionately are women because they're disproportionately represented in precarious and low-skilled work. So again, going back to this question and thinking about our future, how will we respond to this question of women in particular being impacted and vulnerable in the labor market, particularly during COVID? So I'm going to cover some of my emerging concerns that I've been thinking about in terms of what does the future of work look like in South Africa. One of my key concerns is reduced salaries. The ILO has shown that at an international level, even when people are employed, that their wages have been declining. And so that is a real crisis in our country with such high poverty rates. So even when people are employed in waged work, it means that they're going to possibly see reduced wages, and we should be really careful about how this is going to develop going forward. Another issue that is interesting to me is underemployment. We focus a lot on who's employed, but not enough on who is employed at the appropriate skills, what they've studied for, but also working full-time as they would like to work. So I think that is another trend that we should be paying close attention to in terms of what is happening in the labor market, how is it changing, how is underemployment increasing, and it has increased in the latest quarterly labor force survey. I think the other thing that concerns me again, which is related to wages, is that in our country, we've had high levels of working poor. In 2015, they showed that 54% of working people earned below the working poverty line of 4,125 Rand a month. So in thinking about how we move forward, I'm deeply concerned because, we live in a world that is capitalistic and tends to put profits over people. So thinking about how those pressures, downward pressures on wages will impact these large group of working poor in our country. And poverty is a real threat in our country. There are 11.8 million people who are facing hunger as we speak. But also here comes this gendered question, which is of great importance to me. It's this idea of social reproduction. In the context of increasing unemployment, you also see an increase in homemakers who are not seen as workers, and therefore their work is not valued and not compensated. We need to think about how is labor, how are workers produced? We cannot talk about work without thinking about how workers themselves are produced. We saw that there's been disruptions to education, there's been disruptions to early childhood development, which are critical for how workers in the future are going to look. We see that a lot of ECD centers, early childhood development centers, are still closed because they do not have the finances to reopen. And schools, there's great research that shows that it's going to take us years to recover from this current moment. But also again, how are unemployed people going to show up for work, right? How does labor reproduce itself, recreate itself, reproduce itself so that people show up and look for jobs? We saw that the discouraged number of workers has increased significantly in South Africa, and that is a problem, right? It's a question of how are unemployed people able to reproduce themselves. But again, women, are critical to the social reproduction of workers themselves, which is why I started off with this idea of capitalism, this idea that workers are reproduced in the household and that work is not seen as work and it is not waged and it is critical. So what does the future of work look like? I think I'm coming to my end of my minutes that I have here. So in concluding, I think in thinking about the future of work in such a high crisis level, where there's such high unemployment and where women in particular are impacted, and we have to think about, one, how workers themselves are produced, but two, how workers themselves reproduce themselves when they're unemployed. How do they show up to work? What needs to happen for them to show up to work? And then in addition, we do not have sufficient social protection to be able to support these facilities. So I think for me, the future of work, when thinking about it, has to be gendered, it has to be geographic, it has to be aged, it has to consider these various intersections, because without these various intersections, we will not be able to see a prosperous South Africa. And I know it sounds very dim and dull, but to think about when there was lockdown, work continued in households. There was work, there was productive, and there was social productive work that was done even when the economy came to a standstill. And I think the future of work fundamentally has to take that more seriously. The work that is done in household, the productive work that is done in households. And it's not just about, unpaid care work as as one of the topics, but it's actually bigger than that. It's about thinking differently about how we think about the economy and how the economy works, and bridging that gap between social productive work and productive work, which is generally waged. So that's all I had, my reflections in thinking about the future of work in the current moment. It is more of a short-term sort of, these are the crises we're facing, but I think without resolving these crises, we're going to see continuous crises in work and how work changes over time.
Thanks very much, Busi. Let me hand over to Haroon before I slit my wrists completely in this particular regard. But there we are. Haroon, over to you.
Right. Thanks very much, Dennis. I'm going to also try and share my screen. So in fact, Busi and Imraan have given me a nice platform to be slightly narrower, and let me just switch my timer on. What I'm going to do is sort of take a very deliberate take on the seminar, which is thinking about the future of work with applications to South Africa. I must confess, the reduced form of what I'm going to present is based on work we have done for South Africa, trying to sort of apply some of the new literature on the fourth industrial revolution, if you like, to South Africa, and some of the results are particularly interesting. So I think it's generally accepted, and I've taken this World Bank graphic as a really sort of useful way to think about the debates about the fourth industrial revolution or the future of work and what it's likely to do at a sectoral level. And in essence, there's substitutability going on. So in essence, what you would see across sectors is the replacement of old forms of work through automation, through the fourth industrial revolution, if you like, with new jobs. There's a general sense, and I guess that would depend on the sector, that ultimately what will happen is a new lower sort of equilibrium level of employment. And I think, given the previous speakers, the notion of the sort of labor market analog of a very high inequality society like South Africa is that we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. So as much as wages matter, so do jobs matter. And in that context, the fourth industrial revolution could hit potentially very hard in South Africa's context. Let me just find my the laser pointer. So the international literature sort of, again, caricaturing a little bit, differentiates between winners and losers from the fourth industrial revolution. The winners are those that we probably do expect ex ante, which is knowledge workers. So the prediction, and you're seeing that in the US and in Europe, is an increased demand for knowledge workers, as we see those who have very sort of high cognitive components to their work. And I've listed those typical sort of occupations, right? And I think you know that. Perhaps less well appreciated is there actually is some short-term reprieve for those in what the literature is called lousy jobs, right? So those are individuals, and I'll come back to this later, at the bottom end of the occupational distribution, who are in service level type jobs that are non-routine. So effectively, those are really difficult for automation currently to replace. But the big losers from the fourth industrial revolution are individuals in these routine tasks, in the mid-skill occupations, classic sort of blue-collar workers on the assembly line, because the level of automation that we have at the moment will easily and can easily and is replacing these workers. So what you're beginning to see, right, in the American data and in the US, in the European data, is this what is called the hollowing out of the middle of the occupational distribution. So effectively, jobs at the top end and jobs at the bottom end are protected, and the fourth industrial revolution or technology or automation is taking away and replacing those jobs in the middle of the distribution. So this notion of wage polarization is really important, because what it means is that wages in the middle of the distribution are collapsing, right? And that's the evidence we see for the US and for Europe, sometimes called the missing middle. So paralleling this literature on the fourth industrial revolution is this notion of moving away from thinking about occupations to thinking about tasks. Author is very well known in this literature, of course, is probably the global leader, differentiates between routine and cognitive tasks. And you'll notice that as you move across the continuum from routine and cognitive through to non-routine and cognitive, the probability of automation of those jobs declines. What do I mean? Well, if you look at these specific occupations, I like to think of it as actual occupations: mechanics, construction workers, insurance brokers, sales people, right? Those kinds of jobs are routine and then either cognitive or manual, but because of their routine component, quite easily replaced by machines or technology. But if you think of engineers, the creative side of things, somebody even mentioned psychologists, right, which are non-routine and highly cognitive, not predictable, not easily programmable, if you like. Those kinds of tasks, or the job which is intensive in the use of those tasks, will have a low probability of being replaced by machinery. There's also, though, right, this medium probability of non-routine manual jobs. So I've listed them: waiters, security guards, social workers. In South Africa, security guards are a huge component of our industry, of our labor market. So are waiters, because we have a high component of our sectoral output in the services sectors. That means that in a strange kind of way, workers at the bottom end may be protected as well, because these kinds of jobs are non-routine in nature. So just a little bridge before I show you the actual data for South Africa, is that so what we've done in the paper, which I'm happy to share with you, is we've then used a classification method from somebody called Sergio Fopo from Brazil, who classifies jobs according to these kinds of task content. So it's either a job with high information content, you see there, bookkeeper, that has high routine components like a machine operator or an assembler. And then those that have face-to-face content like teachers, on-site content like shop salesperson, and those are highly analytic like an artist or a professional. In each of these cases, though, there's a probability of substitutability by technology, right? So just keeping that in mind, what we then did was to ask the question, well, what has happened to wages across the distribution in South Africa from the lowest to the highest wage earner? So you're going to keep in mind, I've got this whole story about the missing middle and wage polarization in Europe, right? And in the US, because of these jobs in the middle that are being lost and the wages are therefore being suppressed. So what does that picture look like for South Africa? And this is what we get, right? Which is actually, we've now done this for over 18 months, if not longer, right? In terms of various takes of this wage distribution graph. But the first time we saw it, you think there's something wrong, right? That somehow you shouldn't be seeing this hollowing out in the middle of the distribution. Effectively, what you see is wage growth at the bottom end and wage growth at the top end, and you've got wage polarization. You've got this suppression of wages in the middle of the distribution. South Africa seems to be that classic European, North American labor market where technology seems to be protecting jobs at the top end because they're analytic, they're highly cognitive, and those at the bottom end, those lousy service level jobs, and it's getting rid completely of these high routine jobs in the middle of the distribution. And you pick that up by this decline in wages. And so with that in mind, we sort of throw a little bit more sophisticated econometrics at this wage distribution. And again, not to bore you with the details, we sort of come out with this kind of construct where we effectively, sorry if I just, where we effectively, if you look at the right-hand panel, which is the returns to these different types of jobs, information content, decision-making, automotive, on-site or face-to-face. Remember, that's the task content within each occupation. What do we find? Well, in the bottom end, just looking at the right-hand panel, the bottom end of the distribution, there are increased returns to jobs that have a high face-to-face content. Think security guards, think waiters, right? At the top end, there's a growth, and that's that orange line. There's a growth in jobs, right? Or growth in returns for those kinds of jobs that have high decision-making or analytical components. That's up here. It's almost as if we've graphed a missing middle with those two contents, right? What about the middle of the distribution? Well, all of the jobs that have these routine components, like highly automative, on-site, and high information content jobs, those are the ones, remember, that are easily replaceable by machinery. You're seeing negative returns. Effectively, that means that those jobs are being destroyed, right, in the labor market. That's the key effect of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, the paper goes on. We can't put everything at the doorstep of the fourth industrial revolution. For example, a lot of the bottom end jobs here, these lousy service level jobs, are actually minimum wage jobs that are being protected by minimum wage policy. There's also the role of education and the quality of education, but a key part of what's happening in this hollowing out in the middle of the distribution is precisely because of the fourth industrial revolution. So what do we end up with? Well, we end up with, just to repeat, analytical and decision-making and creative tasks, right, which are these non-cognitive, non-routine type tasks, are all these jobs at a sectoral level that are found in sectors like finance the public sector, and they're going to see massive increases in returns, right? The bottom end in South Africa will be supported by minimum wage legislation, but also are very difficult to automate given the current level and price of technology, at least for a middle-income country like South Africa. But there's your big problem, is that last bullet point, is that you've got this muted wage growth in the middle of the distribution. You've got this wage polarization where sectors that are disproportionate in employing, if you like, routine type tasks, whether it's agriculture, mining, manufacturing, are seeing this collapse in semi-skilled jobs, and therefore wages are declining. So ultimately, there's no way in which we can sort of put our head in the sand, South African style. The fourth industrial revolution is going to find us, right, in any way possible. And so we need to be thinking about where technology is impacting on tasks and occupation across the distribution, which sectors are suffering more, and then are there ways in which we can respond both in the short term in terms of protecting, in terms of finding alternatives, ameliorative policies for those who are going to lose their jobs, together with ensuring that we have an adequate supply for the new jobs in respect of the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much. What have I done? Thanks very much, Haroon. And it's now over to Neva.
Hi. So I'm not doing slides, and I'm not showing my head in the slide. Cool. So yeah, so I wanted to go back to what Imraan and Busi were talking about. Although I would love to engage with Haroon on the fourth industrial revolution sometime. But I think the question that arises for me out of those two inputs is, on the one hand, you know, it's been 25 years since we ended apartheid and had the transition to democracy. Why has inequality and joblessness remained, but especially inequality, remained so persistent? And then also, what are the impacts of the dual crisis of COVID and the climate crisis? If we talk about the reproduction of inequality, I think we can agree that inequality was entrenched by apartheid because of the way it led to very unequal distribution of assets of all kinds, work organization, which was effectively designed to de-skill the majority so as to increase the returns to education, and particularly tertiary qualifications. Linked to that, of course, very unequal education, but also access to economic centers and infrastructure through the residential policies. And all of these contributed to higher unemployment, to unequal pay scales, and to more unequal household incomes, particularly combined with mining dependency, which meant that our biggest, the industries that really articulate us for the rest of the world don't actually create jobs on a mass scale. And we end up with employment, and, you know, I'd like to hear what Haroon thinks about this, but, you know, many people would argue that the pattern he's seeing results because, in fact, we've seen the fastest employment growth in services because we haven't managed to get industrialization going. And I'm not sure we can blame for, you know, the new technologies alone for that. But also because we saw the destruction of peasant agriculture and African business generally under apartheid, which means that we have very limited self-employment and very limited informal employment compared to the rest of the world. And so what that means is that in the 2010s, when metals prices internationally were booming, the South African economy did fairly well. And you could see in Imraan's picture on unemployment in his graph that that's where unemployment stabilized for between 5 and 10 years. But the moment metals prices drop, the economy slows down again. But I think the really interesting question is this: if we know how apartheid entrenched inequality, it was explicit, it was conscious, why has it proven so hard for a democratic government to introduce measures to actually change those structures, so the systemic causes of inequality? For instance, even where it should be easy, like ensuring a more equitable educational system, you know, ensuring that cities densify. Some of these things that are actually fairly obvious and don't require, you know, threatening big businesses particularly seriously. And I think that's a question, you know, I'm not saying I have answers, that's why it's a question. I think it's something that we need to unpack if we want to say, how do we ensure in future we manage to do things differently? I mean, one can argue that part of the problem was that the implicit pact in 1994 was that the new government would, desegregate institutions, would obviously have a strong political democracy, would have strong labor laws for workers, would not actually expropriate in the short run, would not compel rich people to live near poor people, and that in the long run, the argument was people should be patient because this whole system will ultimately create more equality, give more people access to basic services, and ultimately to accumulate wealth and to improve prosperity and productivity. And the assumption is, of course, the economy will grow, which will help. And that everybody else gets social grants. And the issue that I think is interesting is before COVID, one can argue that pact, the basis of that pact is people should just be patient and things will get better. And it was becoming clear, as Imran's slides showed, and as Busi was talking about, that for many people it has gotten better, but as long as inequalities remain so deep, then it's very hard for people to appreciate the incremental improvement in their lives when they can see how other people live in luxury. So I think part of the issue is we had a pacting process. When I was in Costa Rica, you ask workers, why did they vote for the ANC? They'll say, because they gave us houses and they gave us social grants. How long does that kind of modest redistribution bring about peace and stability in the workplace, in the economy, in communities? But I also think that the other thing about inequalities, it makes for very sharp contestation over policies and over ownership, both of which make it in some ways harder to grow the economy and to implement decisive policies to deal with inequality. But it also makes elites more complacent because we all live in a bubble. And so it's very easy if you're in a discussion in government, in political parties, not to completely lose track of the core crises facing the country. So in some ways, and this is something you can see across post-colonial Africa, the elites are able to maintain a living standard that is acceptable, that is reasonably comfortable, even when the rest of the country is in deep crisis. And that in itself makes it harder to deal seriously with the crisis. And then just two other issues that I think we also see internationally, which is that it's easy to talk about economic reconstruction. It's very hard to figure out how to do it and what should your priorities be. So I really ask, even in this discussion, what do we think are the top priorities if we want to have not just an economic recovery, but an actual reconstruction that deals with these issues of inequality and joblessness we've been talking about? What would be the priority steps? And in fact, it's really easier to fall back on social grants, and I think that's why the basic income grants, is very easy to sell. It's much harder to talk about what would an industrial policy look like? What would a support for township economies look like? We could actually bring about, reconstruct the economy so you're not just redistributing income to the state, but so that people have their own incomes able to generate themselves. And the second broad issue that is difficult, which I also think is everywhere, is that, we inherited a state, a colonial state that was designed to work from the top down, even if it was sometimes in a paternalistic way, as opposed to the kind of repressive way that we've seen with the enforcement of, for instance, some of the COVID regulations. And that makes it easier to think about handouts rather than promoting collective action. So when we talk about land reform, for instance, we talk about the state will buy up farms and then give them to deserving people. But the moment people themselves say, we want to take land to build housing on, for instance, their city centers, that's a crime that we say we have to stop. And similarly in labor law, and Dennis knows more about all of these things than I do, but what happens in labor law is the state sees itself as a referee. It doesn't see itself as having a job of supporting organizations that are unorganized so that workers have voice, even though we've adopted a system of labor relations where workers must have voice or the whole thing doesn't work. And then just briefly, Dennis, I'm sorry, I've lost track of the time, so tell me when I go on too long.
No, you've got another few minutes.
Okay, fine, then I will speak even faster than usual. I also think that we need to think much more seriously about the impacts of the dual crisis of COVID and the climate. In terms of COVID, it's clearly deepening inequalities in South Africa, both because of the global asset bubble but also because, you know, you talk about the jobs that were lost. If you look at it by occupation, there's been virtually no job losses at all for formal managers and professionals, but other jobs have lost over 10%. And in the informal sector, it's closer to 15%, and domestic work is about 12%. So that what you're seeing is the people where the jobs have been lost and the jobs that are not coming back is lower skilled jobs. Whereas managers and professionals who have the skills, who can use the digital connections and all those things Haroon was talking about with the fourth IR, that's kind of accelerated in the sense that they could work from home, they could stay safe, they don't get sick, and they're able to hang on to their jobs. Also, of course, because with the skills, they're more valued by the employers. And the people who are losing jobs are precisely the people who can't afford to lose them. A second issue there is, of course, the impact of vaccine inequality on a country like South Africa, where we only expect to get most of the adult population vaccinated by the end of the year, if in fact the companies live up to their commitments to supply the vaccines. A final issue there is around fiscal discipline, which is what you can see across Southern Africa, and I just did a paper on this, and it was really clear that countries in Southern Africa do not have the clout on global or even domestic markets to borrow money at affordable rates to do a serious stimulus package. So we've been kind of saved by stimulus packages in the global north in China, which have increased the price of our major metals exports. But we need to come up with very non-conventional ways to come up with a stimulus package, because it's simply not viable for a country like South Africa with now an 8 to 10% fiscal deficit to think that we can simply go and borrow more money internationally. The money is simply not going to be made available. We don't have that kind of clout. We're not like the US or even Europe. So to me, really what we're saying is we need to also decolonize the discussion around the stimulus to say, what would a stimulus for reconstruction look like in South Africa, where we can't simply borrow our way out of the problem? And then finally, the one last thing is to say, in the process, I really think we also have to talk about whether it's in the workplace and the future of work, or in terms of how we manage communities, or in terms of what Busi was talking about in terms of reproductive work. We need to get away from a paradigm that says the government gives people reconstruction, the government gives people service delivery, to a paradigm that says, and this is what we used to talk about in '94. In fact, Jeremy Coney used to talk about it all the time, and I never got it at the time, but now I see what he meant, which is how do we empower workers and communities and women in households also to engage in collective action to empower themselves? What is the role of the state in empowering people as opposed to the role of the state in solving problems for people by allocating resources, which, you know, almost inevitably has an element of patronage and an element of dependency in it that I think is not what we envisioned as the way to reconstruct the South African economy in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neva. In fact, it's a great segue to start, because I'm going to ask each of you, if I may, and I'm going to start with you, Imraan, and literally work my way through the three, well, all four of you, because you can't duck this either, Neva. How come it is that if you start off with Imraan's figures, which are utterly depressing in the extreme, because the official rates that you gave, Imraan, of just over 30-odd%, of course, the expanded definitions over 40%. The inequality, as you indicated right up front, with the most unequal society in the world. How come it is that 25 years later, after democracy, in a sense, we're getting less employment and greater inequality, and that therefore the future of work on any particular basis for the vast majority seem to be very, very bleak? We'll come back to Haroon's argument with regard to the fourth industrial revolution in a moment, but just as a fundamental proposition, how do you react to that? And what's the answer?
So I'm not sure that I have the answer, but let me tell you what I think the two key factors are. So I'd say first, and kind of probably relevant to this, to the issue that we've been talking about, kind of around the future of work, and I think Haroon's numbers really show this out. That what South Africa's been trying to do is to deal with this problem at a time when kind of globally we've gone through quite a big transformation in the way that work is done, and that process of kind of technical change has kind of really played quite a fundamental role in that employment kind of outcome. I think the second kind of issue is that I think Neva is right. We had a kind of social pact of sort that said, you know, we sort of going to follow a particular set of kind of economic policy options, and that we would deal with the poverty issues through some sort of fiscal transfers. Personally, I think those kind of choices were not the best, and that what has happened is while we've managed to keep some balance, I mean, for kind of all of the ANC's problems, I think what they've done reasonably well up to now is to take money from the rich and kind of keep the social compact going. I think what COVID-19 has done is to kind of accelerate the disintegration of that pact. And I think the types of kind of problems that we're going to have to deal with in the next while leaves me feeling pretty pessimistic. But
yes, that's what I want to ask you. I mean, there's nothing.
I think it's a global problem.
Now. But sorry, there's nothing that you tell me now that Mr. Dlamini and Mrs. Dlamini in the township or in the rural areas are going to have any hope at all if they're unemployed.
Yeah, so I think the kind of nature of the problem we kind of have now require two things. One is a global kind of solution around how we deal with kind of processes of technology change, and two, I think South Africa has to have a much more ambitious kind of economic policy package that does offer Mrs. Dlamini a kind of reasonable chance that she's going to find some work.
Okay, Busi, I noticed that when you, I'd be very interested in your response, but I'm particularly interested in your response because you mentioned the word capitalism quite a lot.
Did you want me to go on, Dick?
Sorry? You mentioned capitalism quite a lot in your remarks. And what I suppose I'm asking is, well, one, how come we are in the position we're in at present? Was it a sort of buy-in to a kind of model that didn't exist? And what future then does work have, even on your broader definition, given where we are at present? For the for a very significant majority of South Africans, particularly in the 15 to 24-year age group, who really are more unemployed than employed, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, so I suppose it answers part what the first question was, and to say that, you know, capitalism obviously is sort of the political economy of South Africa, but also it's been accompanied by neoliberal economic policies. And to say that, you know, I was going to say, why are we here, is to say there's a lot of neoliberal economic orthodoxy that's taken place since democracy. And of course, these can be captured by a wide range of policies: low inflation, lightly regulated financial markets, you know, many things. And the logic there was that this enabling macro environment would create growth and investment. And in fact, in our country, a lot of policy, I'd argue, in terms of labor has been, or rather, has focused more on the labor supply and not so much on the labor demand. And there's been a lot of microeconomic interventions therefore, right? So how do we, you know, produce good labor, education, ECDs, all these different things, but not so much policy, pro-employment economic policies for employment, to generate employment in itself. And I think we're obviously going into a period which, again, is a signal of neoliberal economic orthodoxy, which is austerity, right? This is the era that we're in. And so I think the future for young people in our country currently looks very bleak because of this accelerated austerity that we're going to see over the next couple of years in the medium term, but also a lack of demand side policies to generate employment. And so this alignment with orthodoxy, I think for me, is the critical issue. And so what does that mean for the future of work? Is I'd say that it means—
Yes, what does it mean? Well, so give me a sense of what you would do. If I appointed you as the president for the Ministry of Finance, not that in my world, what would you do?
Yes, I think, we need to rethink economics generally. I think globally, one of the things we're seeing is the crisis of capitalism. So what does that mean for economic policy in South Africa? It means, for instance, that the state itself needs to make certain investments to generate jobs. And that means investing in labor-intensive sectors, right? And thinking, how do we use, for instance, a Green New Deal, right, to generate new employment in our economy. And that requires you to think differently, right? It requires a new social compact, for example, is one of the things that is not an economic policy, but it is an initiative that then gives legs to this process. I mean, thinking again with these ideas of unpaid care work and social reproductive work, how do we remunerate women and create, investing in the care economy? The ITUC estimates that if the government implemented a stimulus of 2% of GDP on their care economy, that they could generate 400,000 jobs. And that includes healthcare, elderly care, childcare, and so forth. So I think there's a role that the state can play predominantly to start thinking about how do we grow these particular non-orthodox sectors that we haven't thought about in the past. But of course, the productive sectors, the traditional ones, are still important as well. So labor-intensive sectors need to be invested in as well.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the state in a moment. But Haroon, coming to you, in answering this particular question, I wonder whether you wouldn't mind also taking on board Neva's observation, which would have been my instinctive response to you, which is, well, a lot of people at the top end have done fantastically well out of COVID, like in other parts of the world. I mean, not quite the same as Mr. Musk and the rest of them, but certainly well, particularly well, and that down at the bottom, inequality is exacerbated to an even greater extent than previously was the case, and that in fact, more and more people are being dumped on the heap, as it were. So I'm just curious as to why, one, we've been so ignominiously unsuccessful until now, and secondly, is the future one where it's not just the middle, but that other group that you were speaking about, irrespective of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, are really just going down a cul-de-sac?
Yeah, so Dennis, I mean, for me, there are four core reasons really that I can think of that I mean, it's a wonderful way you put it. It's quite macabre, but how come 25 years later, we still have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world? So the four key reasons start with me. For me, the most important of it all is our growth rate, right? So over the last 40 years, the South African economy has grown. 40 years, we've grown at 0.29% per annum, right? For 40 years. China has grown at 8.5%. Okay, so let's exclude China because they sort of, they're just impossible to compete with. Turkey has grown.
Some of our neighbors have done better.
Turkey has grown by 3%. And the one we always compare ourselves to is Brazil. And you think, well, Brazil grew at 0.89%. That doesn't sound like a lot, except it's 2.5 times faster than we did, right, for 40 years. So effectively, the closest thing you have to a magic bullet, to resolve our unemployment problem is sufficiently high economic growth rates for a long enough period of time. We have failed abysmally, right? The World Bank will release South African economic update in the next few weeks or so, and they've got this very powerful graph that shows our GDP per capita indexed relative to other emerging markets. And if I can do a sort of a Zoom version of showing you what it looks like, it sort of looks like that. South Africa's at the bottom, and all these emerging markets growth rates have exceeded ours consistently. So growth undoubtedly is key. The second is what you and Neva have alluded to, and that's correct, Dennis, is that it's the pattern of growth, right? So the structural patterns of growth we've seen haven't created a sufficient number of jobs in what are classically your labor-intensive sectors that Busi talks about. They tend to be in manufacturing, but agro-processing as well, and parts of what we call light manufacturing. So the structural transformation pattern we've seen, the patterns of growth have generated high returns for those in financial and business services, right? So we're on the sort of high-skilled, services-orientated growth trajectory, with very few jobs being created through manufacturing. In addition, right, the thing that always gets me into trouble with my union friends is that we've had far too large a creation of jobs in the public sector, right? Yeah. Over a third of all jobs over the last decade have come from the public sector. This is not a sustainable form of employment. The third reason for this explosion and the persistence of unemployment is education, Dennis. You know, you've seen all the studies we've seen on returns to education, right, show that in fact one of the key drivers, so Murray Leibrand and Arden Finn did a fantastic paper for UNU wider on returns to education and how that's impacting on wage inequality. And they find that the single biggest reason is actually both the quantity and the quality of schooling being accumulated. So effectively what we're doing in simple terms is we're putting all these learners through a high school system that in fact mitigates against them finding employment, let alone earning a decent wage. And so you've got a really poor quality system. The final one is the one I focused on today, which was technology. Yes. It's yes. Not the only factor, but it's a key factor in that part of the distribution in terms of job losses and job destruction.
Well, thank you. Neva, since you started this, I wanted to ask you, when I listened to Haroon, in fact, when I listened to all three of your panelists, their line is, to some extent, you spoke about we got to accept we had a colonial top-down state. I think that's absolutely right. But I suppose the real question is the state has had a dreadfully detrimental effect on all of this by cocking up the education system, by, on the line of Busi, and she's not the only one, adopting particular forms of austerity, particularly now, which are utterly disastrous. And therefore, unless you actually reconfigure the state, is there any future for work in South Africa?
Okay, so I think, you know, we do have this very post-colonial habit in South Africa of saying we're always worse than everybody else. I mean, I've always been impressed how the Brazilians can come from a country that is often falling apart, and all they tell you is how great they are. And even when things are going well in South Africa, all we can say is how terrible we are. So I just want to flag that I think it's kind of important to be aware of what we've gotten right as well. On that note, you know, I do think we need to systematically look at how the state functions. Sorry, I've been asked to start my video. We do need to systematically look at how the state functions and say, where are you know, it was systematically designed to exclude the voices of the poor and the working people. It was systematically designed to try and prevent them from organizing and showing agency. It was systematically designed to say, if you get anything, it's because we give it to you. So for instance, you mustn't take land, you mustn't try and build your houses where we don't say it's right. You know, you mustn't try and set up businesses unless you have all the licenses and all of those things. And obviously you need some of that, but the way it was designed historically, which was to smash, you know, community and individual organized agency, it's not something that we can use if we want a functional economy now. The one thing I would say is, I do think that, you know, part of the problem with saying benchmark ourselves against other countries is the countries we look like are in Latin America, where you also have countries that are very unequal and very dependent on mining in many cases. And they also have a history, just like us, of very, very slow progress and major setbacks periodically, you know? And I think that part of the problem is we come out of a a situation where we all agreed on what is actually quite a complex solution, which is political democracy. So it seemed like it was simple. We just institute political democracy. We seem to be unable to reach agreement on a similar end state for the economy. And part of what that does is, and I've seen this personally in government, is people just give up. It's like, it's so hard to talk about how do you generate employment. And we as experts, we come up with all these, these complex answers. And we can't say, here are 3 priorities that would work. And one of them is what you said, fix education. No? Another one would be, think about what does it mean to build a township economy? What would it take to build an environment where people can build up their own livelihoods and improve conditions in the township setting? What could the state do to support that without taking away their agency? And a third thing might be, for instance, what we've been saying, fix electricity. And if we could come up with a few of those things where, like you said, the impacts, the measure of success should be, how are we improving lives for people in the bottom 60% of the income distribution, not just in terms of their living standards and their incomes, but also in terms of their ability to feel they are empowered in their lives and building community. And what would that like? And I think also what Busi said, which is, and particularly Ms. Dlamini, who has been unable to get a job herself because, women have a much harder time getting into the formal sector, partially because she doesn't have daycare, no? Partially because she didn't finish the trip. What would that look like? No? And how could we give her the power to feel like she's controlling that process? She's not just being given something. No?
But can I just ask you this? Busi raised the point, Neva, and I wanted to ask you this, which I think is terribly important. It is that not only do you then have these massive levels of unemployment, but in a sense, the way in which the system is structured, that women, you don't have daycare centers, you don't have any support for children growing up, which means that right from the get-go, they kind of are literally behind the starter's flag. And if you've got, for example, countries which are starting to respond to a 4th industrial revolution, you literally are putting them in a position where it is almost impossible for them to actually participate in any kind of viable economy. I mean, how does one deal with that?
I mean, you know how you deal with it. You have to find the resources. And the one thing I would say is,
we don't have the resources according to you.
Well, I'm saying I think we need innovative ways to find them off budget. So for instance, and I know you can be quite conservative on these issues here, but the issues
I'm not conservative on these issues. Don't come and say.
I actually think we should do, one of my things is I said on some issues, around some fiscal issues. Let's not even go to a wealth tax, okay?
Okay.
But so for instance, we are in a crisis. When you're in a wartime crisis, what do? You go to rich people and say, you need to put some money up front because the long-term effects of not fixing this are too terrible to contemplate for all of us. And I think we should be saying we need to have a surcharge on the income tax, which instead of which we actually reduce it in real terms and made it less progressive. And maybe we should be looking at the equivalent of war bonds and how we could manage that in a way that's like only semi-voluntary, if you see what I mean. So that you may not compel people to invest in it, but you make the incentives very strong, no? And you do it as a console, the way they did with war bonds. But I think we need to be saying, what is that kind of emergency financing? We had to fight, well, it wasn't even me, Rudy and other people had to fight like hell to get the surplus off the UIF. It's like, why do we have a surplus in the the unemployment insurance fund if it is not to deal with a crisis like COVID? And then what do? They cut it off while, as Imraan said, unemployment is only just beginning to recover. They cut that thing off because they want to keep 60 billion rands in their back pocket. It's like, for what? We're a social protection fund. So I think we need to say this stuff is disruptive, but what we have is a consistent bias also in government that looks at the risks of disruption, doesn't look at the risks of the status quo. And I think we need to somehow break through that bubble to say, if you keep doing what you're doing, the risks, as everybody here has been saying, the risks just get worse and worse for society as a whole. And at some point, you won't be able to keep yourself protected.
I got you. Imraan, I want to put you on the spot here because I know you suggested right at the beginning that perhaps you were the only one who didn't want to a basic income grant for everybody. But let's take that aside for the moment. Do you accept the argument that the only way you're going to actually create a response to this awful, god-awful levels of unemployment, and in fact say to Mrs. Dlamini, there is a future for you, is very significant funding by the state of a whole range of targeted programs of the kind that Neva's talking about?
I mean, I kind of agree that we need to kind of think about ways in which we can get to a much more inclusive economy. So I kind of agree with Haroon that the kind of problem has been that we haven't had growth, and the kind of real
the one thing you're not going to
how,
get growth is if you have, but sorry, you're not going to, if you're going to have a massive austerity program of the kind that was in the budget, then you can write goodbye to growth and to Mrs. Dlamini's future.
Yeah, so I'm convinced that the only way out of the conundrum we have is that we have to find a way to grow out of it. That once you start growing, some of those macroeconomic and tax numbers that you think about become a lot easier to manage in a growing economy. And the question is how do you grow it? I think we've got to see the kind of structural problems in South Africa not as a dead end, but as a way for us to grow. So kind of having such large parts of our economy and such large parts of our population marginalized has to become an opportunity. We have to think about what are the ways in which we can get a growth project going that would bring all of the kind of unpaid care work, bring all of the informal economy, bring all of those who don't have opportunities into the economy, and find ways to create opportunities for them. That means a massive investment, program kind of in things such as social infrastructure, improving outcomes in education, etc. So I think we've got to grow our way out of the problem, and that way has to be to deal with the marginalized nature of the economy.
Thank you. All right, so Busi, let me put this to you. I don't see anything. You can contradict me as much as you like. I'm just putting you a controversial proposition. I don't see anything on the table which indicates to me a level of inclusive growth that's going to allow Mrs. Dlamini and the people that you were talking about, who ultimately have got no care, can't basically care for their children, are marginalized in every extreme. I can't see any particular economic policy on the table that is going to create the kind of work opportunities for them that will redress the position of lack of social justice and economic justice that we have. But maybe I'm wrong.
Very interesting comment. I think I agree with you. I think in the short to immediate run, I think this is where I'd make the argument that, I think a universal basic income grant is critical just as a human rights issue. I believe that every human being should have the basics access to their needs, right? To deal with their needs, whether they're able to work or not, right? And there's ways to claw back on taxes, there's ways to finance this, there's a way to design a fiscally neutral UBIG. There's many interesting solutions to make this work. I do agree that in the long run, we need to, think about how do we expand work, how do we grow, as Imraan is talking about. I just don't see that in the immediate run. And I think that, it's almost like when you think about a policy and you say we're going to create, let's say, an employer of last resort in South Africa, right? The government's going to create this employer of last resort. Again, some of these ideas come from a very patriarchal idea, right? All women will be employed, but okay, where are the children going to go? Like, what is supposed to happen to all these children? Are we going to give people, what wages are we going to give people? Just to remind everybody again that the expanded public works program pays below the minimum wage. Right? When we think about working poor, are we just generating a larger group of working poor people in South Africa? And
well, it appears to me that we are. It appears to me that we are.
It's been growing, exactly. And so to me, the question is, I think our solutions, I just don't see them immediately and also like yielding the returns we want immediately. And I think in the interim, until we can get to this beautiful vision, we have to protect the people of our country, and we have to, you know, do whatever it takes. I think we are in a humanitarian crisis, and social cohesion is so important, right? Like, I don't think we can talk about wages and work without talking about the social cohesion that is needed for our country to actually just like survive and work. So these are critical issues. So I think, yeah, the solutions will come, and there are many, and people think about them all the time. We write about them all the time. I'm sure everyone on this panel has written great solutions, but it's also about what is a coordinated economic plan. So it's beautiful that we all do our work in our silos, but when we say, how do we combine Busi's care work concerns with Neva's industrial, you know, how do we collate all of these into an actual coordinated economic plan that takes our country forward? Without that, I don't think we're going to go anywhere. We're just going to have some successes, mixed bag.
Well, thank you for being so optimistic. Haroon, just one final question to you, because time's going on, and I'd like to see whether anybody would like to ask us questions, and they're invited to tell me on the chat line so that I can put them to people, to anybody. But I wanted to ask you this. I mean, everybody on this panel, and every time I have a panel, people tell me about growth, and they say, well, growth is the solution. And I say, okay. And I had the discussion with you the other day in relation to a webinar that you got me involved in. And so you said to me, well, you know, it's not so bad if we grow 2 or 3%, but you know, and I know that at 2 and 3%, we aren't going to address these figures that we're talking about. So where is it happening? Or must I really go and have a large glass of wine and drown my sorrows?
So that's not a bad idea. I mean,
Thank you. You can have one with me.
Second best solution is, you know, I do think there's a, you know, we need to think a little bit out of the box in terms of how we can kickstart growth, or how we can support the poor and so on. So firstly, in terms of growth, think about, Dennis, it's important that we are honest about what we see as the constraints to economic growth, right? Some of it may be skills. Some of it in the short run may be ideas about input costs, competition policy, right? High concentration levels, all sorts of things do need sort of creative distraction in the policy arena. But just to get back to two ideas, one is, Imraan raised it. One way to think about the highest unemployment rate in the world, which South Africa has, is also one of the lowest informality rates in the emerging markets.
Yes. Could I ask you, sorry, Haroon, I'm going to forget. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could I, it's a terribly important point, and it was a whole thing I wanted to ask people, but I'm going to forget. So in your answer, if you could just give us a 30-second why that is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I did want you to answer that.
So you know, we've got, you know, it's like 20, depending on the year, but 20% of the labor market are in the informal sector, whereas it's north of 40% for Latin America. That's the average. And that's partly an apartheid-based reasoning. So spatial dissonance means that people are living far away from where cities and jobs are, right? It's not a New Delhi, it's not Rio de Janeiro, and so on. And that's one reason. The other reason is, as a consequence of that, local governments across the country see it their job to keep the informal sector away, right? And so in many different ways, unlocking growth, what are the low-hanging fruits available for unlocking growth? is to allow the informal sector unfettered access to markets. The final point before I stop, Dennis, is we keep on going on about spend on this, spend on that, right? So we have social security spending on the poor, old age pension, child support grant that is very well targeted at one of the highest in the world. It's also one of the most costly in the world. So there's a huge advantage not to spending more, but spending more efficiently. And so you can look at even the outcomes in education are incredibly poor for the amount that we spend. And so the dial must be moved back to how can we spend better? How can we think about getting a greater return for the existing fiscal envelope that we have? Thanks.
Thanks. Haroon, Imraan, you wanted to make a comment about the informal economy. With pleasure.
I mean, I think this is a huge problem in South Africa. So I'll kind of give you a practical example. If I'm in kind of any other place in the world, I see lots of small operators baking bread, doing all sorts of small interesting things. The kind of question is, why does that not happen in South Africa? I think it's kind of that problem's really on the demand side of the economy, that we have such powerful interests in the formal economy. You know, go to the most kind of rural part of South Africa. The bread that people eat there is baked in the large urban centers, transported to the rural areas. There's kind of simply no capital flow that happens in kind of small communities like it does elsewhere. And I think that has a lot to do with market structure and powerful interest groups that really control the demand side of the economy. And I think that is kind of a problem that we really need to deal with.
Okay, I wanted just to ask, thanks. I'm gonna, if not, I'll ask Neva something, but I wanted to ask whether there's anybody here listening who'd like to ask a question. Please use the chat line and I can put it to the participants. Well, whilst I'm waiting for that, if there is, let me then final question to Neva. Neva, just looking at the fourth industrial revolution, does that mean that to a large degree, as bad as it is, given the appalling levels of education, that in fact we're even less equipped to deal with the problem going forward? And then Neville, I will ask, you can have your question as soon as Neva's answered.
The answer is, of course, yes. But I do think, just to flag, I think this is something we also need to look at very specifically as in the global south, that, you know, faced with rising wages in the global north, companies can do two things. They can introduce new technologies, or they can transfer especially dirty production to other countries. So it's what's always happened is these technologies have lagged tremendously when they get to the global south. Because for a long time, you bring in labor to do things where it's cheaper than to bring in the technology. And we start bringing in the technology when that becomes such a strong paradigm that nothing else exists. So we likely will get robots in the auto assembly companies, but I'm not sure that we'll replace sweepers with those little vacuum cleaners that bump into walls, as long as labor is relatively cheap. No? So I'm not convinced. I think the fourth IR thing, we have to look at how does it play out where you're not seeing the very high pay that you see in the global north, which leads to deindustrialization there generally, and this then becomes another way to get to the same thing. Yeah, but clearly the fact that, for instance, only 10% of our schools have computer literacy, that we usually don't have cultural or design studies, that many people, particularly in the historically descending areas, only study in their home language until they get to secondary school, and then suddenly they have to deal with English.
Yeah.
You know, all of those things are major problems. And also, of course, the way we teach math, which is not designed for people in the economy, but designed to go on to university to a large extent, even now, if they teach it at all. So I think, yes, the whole education system was designed to get people to not get people into university, if you see what I mean, 30 years ago. And now it's neither suitable for citizens or for workers. And I think that's a major problem.
Yeah, that's a great debate. Thank you. Neville, please ask your question, and then we'll call it a day.
Well, I mean, I just want to thank Judge Dennis Davis for asking a range of tough questions and the panelists for responding with such a plumb.
Your present is in the purse.
I would like to ask Judge Davis a question, which is,
okay.
you've been asking everybody else for solutions, and fair enough. So how do you think, where's tax in all of this? So what are your aspirations around the tax code in terms of distribution or fostering growth, or any of the solutions that we've heard here?
I think that's a massive question. Neva sort of baited me by suggesting that I'm against the wealth tax. I'm not at all. What I'm looking for is, where can we get the most money? And I'm not sure that a wealth tax gets you the most money. I agree with her. I would have no problem by having some surcharge on income tax, although again, I'm not certain how much that brings in. What I can tell you is, if we're talking about significant sums of money, it's in the evasion of tax. I think that if it doesn't, I mean, people may not know this, but in other words, if we collect 100, there's at least 15 that we're not collecting because of criminal activity. And if we can get 7 or 8 of that in, that's actually more than we can get elsewhere. So my aim has been to try to plug the gaps, and that's high net worth individual gaps. I mean, everybody in South Africa knows my story about the people the 40 Ferrari club, or the 40 Ferraris that rocked up at a coffee shop. And I managed to get one of our revenue people who I'd inspired sufficiently to basically take their number plates and then audit them, and discovered that each and every single one of them was in fact returning taxable income of probably no more than 10% of what the motor car was worth. And so what I'm trying to say to you is, there's a massive amount that we can collect there. I would also be having incentives for workers, that is to encourage employment, and that we should be looking at a whole range of tax incentives, not the crap ones that we've got, ones that actually could inspire more forms of jobs and the trajectory of those jobs, so we could kind of get them. But ultimately, and I think we should be, if in the short term we can't do that, then Neva's correct. We should not be using austerity. In fact, the last budget was a disaster in South Africa. We kind of subsumed a discourse of austerity, which I think is going to be very, very detrimental to the long-term future of work. That's a very short answer to a very complicated question, Neville, but which I'd be happy to debate with anybody as we go on. But I see that we've come to 9 o'clock. Before handing over to you, may I just thank all 4 of our panelists for fantastic contributions. I mean, I think, you could have a whole, I mean, there are about 5 or 6 research projects that could emerge. Some of them I know that Haroon and probably Neva and Busi and Imraan are doing, but there are others that emerged out of this for me that seem to me just absolutely central to the solution. But I just wanted to, and I just want to say one other thing. As gloomy as I am about South Africa, I always think when I listen to people like the 4 of them, I can't be living in a bad country when you've got such extraordinarily talented people focusing their minds on these particular points. That's a tremendous inspiration to me. But over to you, and thank you very much.
All right, I would like to echo Dennis's thanks. I think this was a terrific panel. I would urge everybody who has the time, I know this is the joy of Zoom, is you have lots of people in different time zones. The problem with Zoom is it makes scheduling very difficult. It also makes travel cheap, so we can, I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do this event on the cheap like we manage now, if not for COVID. But I don't want to be too much of a silver lining person. We have a range of other events this week that focus on the informal economy, labor migration. So I urge people to look at the program and come to what interests you. We also have another event tomorrow on South Africa, but that's a collaboration between UT and UCT. So if you're a UT person or a UCT person, please try come to that. If you don't have a Zoom invite, send me an email. All right, I think
Thanks, Neville.
it's 2:01.
Take care,
Thank you very
everybody.
much, everybody. Thanks.
Everybody stay safe. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.